there comes a moment in life when silence breaks, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with clarity. A moment when you realize you are no longer reacting, no longer shrinking, no longer surviving. You are standing. And that is when the atmosphere shifts, not because you changed into something threatening, but because you healed into something uncontrollable. Your calm became unfamiliar. Your boundaries felt sudden. Your strength, once drained for others, returned to its rightful place. And in that quiet transformation, something old and uneasy stirred. You see, healing does not announce itself. It doesn't seek permission or applause. It simply happens, slowly, deeply, honestly. And when it does, it disrupts systems that depended on your confusion. The patterns that once felt normal begin to crack. The expectations that fed on your silence no longer work. You stop explaining yourself. You stop absorbing blame that was never yours. You start choosing peace without justification. And that choice sends a message louder than any argument ever could. This is where the tension begins. Because when you heal, you don't become cruel, you become clear, and clarity is dangerous to anything built on control, fear, or emotional dependence. What once felt powerful now feels exposed. What once commanded obedience now senses resistance. Not because you are fighting back, but because you are no longer available for the role you were assigned. So if the energy around you shifted, if the tone changed when you stopped overgiving, if discomfort appeared the moment you chose yourself, understand this. It is not your healing that caused chaos. It is the fear of losing control over someone who finally remembered their worth. Healing exposes what control was hiding. There is a strange moment that arrives after healing, not celebration, not applause, but tension, a subtle shift in the air. Conversations feel heavier, reactions feel sharper, and you begin to notice something unsettling. The very people who once claimed to want your happiness now seem unsettled by your calm. This is not coincidence, this is exposure. Because healing does not just mend the wounded. It reveals the structures that depended on that wound staying open. For a long time, your pain was predictable. Your silence was useful. Your self-doubt made you manageable. When you were exhausted, confused, or constantly seeking approval, the balance of power remained intact. Roles were clear. Expectations were unquestioned. You carried emotional weight that was never meant to be yours, and in doing so, you kept the system running. But healing interrupts that arrangement. It quietly removes you from the position of emotional laborer, absorber, and stabilizer. And when that happens, what was hidden can no longer stay concealed. You see, control rarely announces itself as control. It disguises itself as concern, tradition, responsibility, or this is just how things are. It thrives in environments where one person is always adjusting while others remain unchanged. While you were hurting, you adjusted. You explained yourself. You apologized for reactions that were shaped by years of pressure. You softened your truth to keep the peace. And in that softness, control remained comfortable, but healing hardens something important inside you, not your heart, but your clarity. Once clarity arrives, manipulation loses its language. Guilt no longer lands the same way. Emotional pressure feels visible instead of powerful. You begin to recognize patterns rather than personalizing every reaction. And this is where discomfort begins, not in you, but around you. Because the moment you stop internalizing blame, it has nowhere to go. The moment you stop reacting emotionally, emotional tactics lose their effect. The moment you stop explaining yourself, those who relied on your explanations feel exposed. Healing turns the lights on, and when the lights come on, everyone sees the room for what it truly is. The hierarchy, the unspoken rules, the roles that were never fair. And those who benefited from the darkness feel threatened, not because you attacked them, but because visibility removes their advantage. Your healing becomes a silent confrontation, not with words, but with presence, not with anger, but with steadiness. This is why reactions change, why small boundaries provoke big emotions, why your calm is suddenly labeled as distance, coldness, or defiance. It is not because you became difficult, it is because you became difficult to control. You stopped needing permission to rest. You stopped asking for validation before trusting your own feelings. You stopped volunteering yourself as the emotional shock absorber, and that shift disrupts everything that was built around your compliance. What's important to understand is this: healing does not create conflict, it reveals it. The tension was always there. The imbalance existed long before you noticed it. Your pain simply kept you focused on surviving rather than seeing. But once you heal, you see clearly. You notice who only felt safe when you were small, who felt comfortable when you doubted yourself, who enjoyed access to you without accountability. And that realization is unsettling because it changes how you move through the world. You begin to speak less but mean more. You react slower but with intention. You no longer rush to fix what you did not break, and in doing so, you remove yourself from emotional games you didn't know you were playing. That removal feels like loss to those who depended on your participation. They may call it change. They may call it distance. But what it truly is withdrawal from control. Healing does not make you superior. It makes you sovereign. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop restraining your truth to fit old narratives. You stop betraying yourself to maintain harmony that only existed when you were hurting. And once you stop doing that, the illusion collapses. Control cannot survive awareness. It cannot survive self-trust. It cannot survive a person who no longer doubts their own reality. So if healing brought tension into your life, understand this clearly. You did not cause it. You uncovered it. You didn't destroy the system. You simply stepped out of the role that kept it functioning. And when that role disappears, everything that relied on it panics. Not because you became dangerous, but because you became free. Your peace disrupted an old power system. Peace is often misunderstood. People think it is passive, quiet, harmless. But real peace, the kind that comes after deep healing, is disruptive. It does not argue. It does not defend itself. It does not chase approval. And that is precisely why it unsettles systems that were built on emotional reaction, compliance, and unrest. When you found peace, you didn't overthrow anything. You simply stopped participating. And in doing so, you disrupted a power structure that depended on your emotional availability. For a long time, your reactions were predictable. You responded quickly, explained deeply, felt intensely, and cared endlessly. That emotional openness made you accessible. It allowed others to steer conversations, control narratives, and redirect responsibility. When tension arose, you were the one expected to smooth it over. When emotions ran high, you were the one expected to absorb the impact. Your nervous system became the regulator for everyone else's comfort. And in that imbalance, a quiet system of power took shape. But peace changes the rhythm. When you healed, you slowed down. You stopped reacting instantly. You stopped matching emotional intensity with emotional intensity. You began to pause, to observe, to choose your responses instead of being driven by them. And that pause, simple, calm, deliberate, felt threatening, because systems built on control rely on urgency. They rely on triggering reactions before reflection can occur. Your peace removed the urgency, and with it, the leverage. An old power system does not announce itself with authority, it survives through expectation. Expectations about who will yield, who will adjust, who will carry the emotional weight when things become uncomfortable. Your peace broke those expectations. You no longer rushed to reassure. You no longer over-explained your decisions. You no longer bent your boundaries to avoid discomfort. And suddenly, the balance shifted, not dramatically, but undeniably. But this is where confusion begins for those around you. They sense the change, but they cannot name it. They feel less influence, but they cannot articulate why. Conversations that once felt manageable now feel uncertain. Emotional cues that once worked now fall flat. Not because you became distant, but because you became grounded. And grounded people cannot be easily pulled into chaos. Peace removes you from emotional transactions that were never equal. You stop bargaining with your energy. You stop trading your calm for acceptance. You stop proving your loyalty through self-sacrifice. And when that happens, those who benefited from your unrest feel destabilized. because their sense of control was never rooted in strength. It was rooted in your willingness to stay unsettled. What's important to understand is that peace does not challenge power directly, it renders it irrelevant. You are no longer motivated by fear of conflict, fear of rejection, or fear of misunderstanding. You accept that not everyone will be comfortable with your choices, and you allow that discomfort to exist without trying to fix it. That allowance is radical. It says, I trust myself enough to let others feel what they feel. And that trust dismantles manipulation quietly. Your peace also exposes how much noise once surrounded you. You begin to notice how often tension was manufactured, how often crises were exaggerated, how often emotional pressure was used to regain influence. And because you are no longer reactive, those tactics lose momentum. They echo without response. They linger without resolution. And in that silence, the system reveals itself. This is why peace is often met with resistance. Not because it is wrong, but because it cannot be controlled. You are no longer pulled into roles you didn't choose. You are no longer shaped by emotional demands disguised as obligation. You stand steady, not defiant, not aggressive, just unmoved. And that stillness is unsettling to anyone who relied on your movement to feel powerful. Your peace is not withdrawal, it is alignment. You are aligned with your values, your limits, your inner truth. You no longer need to convince anyone of your intentions. You let your consistency speak. And consistency, when rooted in peace, becomes a form of quiet authority. It cannot be argued with. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be guilted into submission. So if your peace caused disruption, understand this: the disruption was overdue. What collapsed was not harmony, but control. What shifted was not love, but leverage. You did not take power away. You simply stopped giving it away. And in doing so, you discovered a truth that cannot be undone. Peace is not the absence of strength. It is strength that no longer needs permission. Growth threatens what refuses to change. Growth is rarely loud. It doesn't arrive with declarations or demands. It enters quietly, through reflection, through difficult realizations, through the decision to stop repeating what once felt familiar. And yet, nothing unsettles stagnant environments more than someone who begins to grow. Not because growth is offensive, but because it introduces movement into places that survive by staying the same. When you changed, you didn't abandon anyone. You simply stopped remaining where you had outgrown the space. For a long time, sameness kept things comfortable. Patterns repeated. Roles remained fixed. Expectations were predictable. Even pain followed a familiar script. And within that predictability, there was a sense of security, not because it was healthy, but because it was known. Your growth disrupted that familiarity. You began asking different questions. You made choices that no longer aligned with old routines. You stopped accepting explanations that once went unchallenged. And in doing so, you disturbed an unspoken agreement that nothing would change. What people often resist is not your growth, but the reflection it creates. When you evolve, you hold up a mirror without saying a word. Your new awareness highlights old habits. Your new boundaries expose old excesses. Your new self-respect contrasts sharply with dynamics that relied on self-neglect. And for those who are not ready to change, that contrast feels uncomfortable. It forces them to confront what they have avoided. And avoidance, once challenged, often reacts with defensiveness. Growth removes you from roles that kept others comfortable. You are no longer the one who adjusts endlessly. You are no longer the one who adjusts endlessly. You are no longer the one who absorbs tension without question. You are no longer the one who explains away behavior that should have been examined. And when you step out of those roles, the structure wobbles. Because those roles were never neutral, they were load-bearing. Your growth shifts the weight, and suddenly others are asked to carry what they once placed on you. This is why growth is often misunderstood as distance, disloyalty, or change in character. Not because you became someone unrecognizable, but because you stopped being predictable. You no longer respond the way you used to. You no longer prioritize the same things. You no longer prioritize the same things. You no longer accept the same narratives. And unpredictability threatens systems that depend on repetition. Growth introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty exposes fragility. What's important to understand is that growth does not demand that others change, it simply reveals who is willing to. You didn't issue ultimatums, you didn't require anyone to follow your path, you simply walked forward. And that forward movement created a gap. Some stepped into it with curiosity, others resisted it with fear. Because to refuse growth is to cling to familiarity, even when familiarity no longer serves. Your growth also shifts how you measure connection. You stop confusing history with intimacy. You stop equating longevity with alignment. You begin to value mutual respect over shared pasts. And that recalibration can feel threatening to those who relied on the past to maintain relevance. When the future becomes your focus, the past loses its power to define you. Growth asks for accountability, not from others, but from yourself. You become more honest about what you can tolerate, more discerning about what you invest in, more selective about what you carry forward. And that discernment changes the dynamics around you, because you are no longer available for patterns that require your stagnation. You no longer participate in cycles that depend on your compliance. This is where resistance intensifies, because growth exposes a choice: evolve or remain. And not everyone is ready to face that decision. Some will attempt to pull you back, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of being left behind, fear of being confronted, fear of change itself. But understand this clearly: your growth is not an attack. It is an invitation, one that others can accept or decline. You did not become difficult, you became deliberate. You did not become distant, you became directed. You did not change for the sake of change, you changed for the sake of change. You changed for the sake of truth, and truth has a way of unsettling environments built on avoidance. But that discomfort is not your responsibility to resolve. So if your growth made others uneasy, let that be information, not accusation. It tells you where resistance lives, it shows you what refuses to move, and it reminds you why you began this journey in the first place. Not to disrupt, but to become whole. Growth threatens what refuses to change, because growth proves that change is possible. And once possibility exists, stagnation can no longer pretend to be destiny. Boundaries felt like rebellion to the unhealed. Boundaries are often mistaken for walls. People imagine them as acts of separation, rejection, or defiance. But in truth, boundaries are acts of clarity. They define where responsibility ends and respect begins, and yet, when you set them, the reaction you received felt disproportionate. Calm decisions were met with tension. Simple limits were treated like declarations of war, not because your boundaries were extreme, but because they disrupted expectations that were never meant to be questioned. For a long time, access to you was assumed. Your time, your energy, your emotional availability were taken for granted. You were expected to respond quickly, explain thoroughly, and accommodate endlessly. These expectations were not always spoken, but they were enforced through subtle cues: disappointment, silence, pressure, or emotional weight. And because you cared, you complied. You adjusted your needs to preserve connection. You minimized your discomfort to maintain peace. In doing so, you taught others that your limits were flexible, negotiable, even invisible. When you healed, that invisibility ended. You began to notice when something felt misaligned. You recognized when a request carried an unspoken cost. You felt the difference between generosity and obligation. And instead of overriding that awareness, you honored it. You said no without apology. You paused before responding. You chose distance where closeness required self-betrayal, and that choice was perceived as rebellion, not because it was aggressive, but because it was new. To the unhealed, boundaries feel personal. They interpret limits as rejection rather than self-respect. They hear no as accusation. They experience your self-protection as a threat. This is because unhealed systems rely on access, not consent. They function smoothly when roles remain unchallenged and discomfort is absorbed by the most accommodating person. When you stopped absorbing, the system felt exposed, and exposure often triggers defensiveness. What's important to understand is that your boundaries did not create conflict, they revealed entitlement. Entitlement thrives where limits are absent. It assumes availability without accountability. It expects understanding without reciprocity. And when boundaries appear, entitlement reacts with confusion, frustration, or attempts to regain control. That reaction is not a reflection of your wrongdoing, it is a reflection of a dynamic that was never balanced. Boundaries also change how communication unfolds. You stop over-explaining. You stop justifying decisions that are rooted in self-care. You stop negotiating your well-being to avoid discomfort. Your words become fewer but firmer. Your presence becomes steadier but less accessible. And for those who relied on your emotional flexibility, this shift feels like loss. Not because you withdrew love, but because you withdrew tolerance for what drained you. This is why boundaries are often met with narratives. You may be labeled distant, changed, or difficult. These labels are attempts to restore the old dynamic by framing your self-respect as a flaw. But boundaries are not punishments. They are instructions. They teach others how to engage with you in a way that honors both parties. Those who value connection will adjust. Those who value connection will adjust. Those who valued control will resist. Boundaries require you to accept discomfort, yours and others. You allow misunderstandings to exist without rushing to resolve them. You accept that not everyone will agree with your choices. You tolerate temporary tension rather than long-term self-abandonment. And that tolerance is strength. It signals that you trust yourself enough to withstand disapproval without collapsing into guilt. For the unhealed, this is deeply unsettling because they are accustomed to emotional immediacy. They expect access to be restored through pressure or persistence. When that no longer works, they feel powerless. And rather than examining their expectations, they question your character. But understand this, boundaries do not change who you are. They reveal who others thought you were supposed to be. Your boundaries are not about pushing people away. They are about defining how close people can come without causing harm. They protect your peace, your growth, your sense of self. They allow you to show up fully rather than resentfully. And while they may feel like rebellion to those who never healed, they are, in truth, an act of maturity. So if your boundaries were met with resistance, let that resistance inform you. It shows where access was valued more than respect. It reveals where connection was conditional on your compliance, and it reminds you why boundaries matter not to isolate you, but to ensure that what remains in your life can meet you with the same care you now give yourself. Healing makes you uncontrollable, and that is the fear. There is a particular kind of fear that emerges when someone can no longer be steered by old levers. It is not loud, not dramatic, not always visible. It hides behind concern, confusion, and questions that sound innocent but carry urgency. This fear appears when healing reaches its final stage, not the stage where pain is processed, but the stage where influence no longer works. When you healed, you did not become unreachable. You became unmanageable to anything that relied on your insecurity. For a long time, control operated through emotional access. Guilt could redirect you. Silence could unsettle you. Approval could motivate you. Disapproval could paralyze you. These were not weaknesses, they were open doors formed by empathy, care, and a desire for connection. But healing closed those doors selectively, not by hardening you, but by grounding you. You learned to sit with discomfort without rushing to resolve it. You learned to sit with discomfort without rushing to resolve it. You learned to trust your inner signals over external pressure. And in that learning, control lost its entry points. Uncontrollable does not mean reckless. It means self-directed. You are no longer moved by urgency that is not yours. You no longer react to emotional intensity as a command. You no longer react to emotional intensity as a command. You no longer mistake pressure for importance. Your decisions come from alignment rather than fear. And this shift is deeply unsettling to systems that depended on your predictability. Because when someone cannot be rushed, they cannot be rejected easily. Healing also changes your relationship with validation. You stop seeking permission to feel what you feel. You stop outsourcing your sense of right and wrong. You listen, but you do not surrender. You consider, but you do not collapse. And that internal authority becomes unmistakable. Others may sense it before they understand it. They notice that persuasion takes longer, that emotional appeals fall flat, that old patterns no longer produce the same outcomes, and this loss of influence feels like loss of control. What's important to understand is that fear arises not because you gained power over others, but because others lost power over you. You are no longer anchored to their reactions. Their approval no longer defines your worth. Their disappointment no longer defines your direction. And when someone realizes they can no longer shape your behavior through emotional means, they must confront the reality of relating to you as an equal or not at all. Healing makes you consistent. You no longer fluctuate based on mood, conflict, or pressure. You show up the same way whether things are calm or tense. And consistency is powerful because it removes leverage. There is no emotional high to chase, no low to exploit. You become steady. And steadiness cannot be manipulated. It can only be respected or avoided. This is why some people respond to your healing with distance or discomfort, not because you changed into something harmful, but because the familiar ways of engaging with you no longer work. They may test boundaries, revisit old narratives, or attempt to provoke reactions. But when those attempts fail, the fear becomes clear. The fear of having to relate without control. The fear of having to communicate honestly. The fear of having to take responsibility for one's own emotions. Uncontrollable also means unburdened. You stop carrying what was never yours. You stop managing emotions you did not create. You stop fixing problems you did not cause. And in releasing those burdens, you reclaim energy. That reclaimed energy goes into your growth, your peace, your purpose. And when your life begins to move forward without permission, it sends a clear message: you are no longer available for manipulation. Healing does not isolate you. It refines your connections. Those who value mutual respect will feel safer with you, not threatened. Those who value control will feel exposed. And that distinction is not something you have to enforce. It reveals itself naturally. Your calm becomes the filter. Your boundaries become the standard. Your self-trust becomes the measure. So if healing made others uneasy, let it be confirmation, not doubt. You did not lose your compassion, you gained discernment. You did not lose your softness, you gained structure. You did not lose your connection, you lost your vulnerability to control. And that loss, for some, feels like fear. But for you, it is freedom. A freedom that does not shout, does not dominate, does not seek revenge. It simply stands firm, unmoved, awake, and no longer available for anything that requires you to abandon yourself.